Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's keeping safe. Um, as I suspect, everybody's working from home today, and this is primarily what we're going to be talking about, how we've expanded our threat surface from everybody working from home, potentially as less secure than our offices. So we're going to talk about some of the vulnerabilities that people are using to and the techniques they're using to actually exploit those vulnerabilities and how we can mitigate them. So today we're actually got one of our close partners, Digital Shadows, which is going to walk us through the various techniques and also mitigation techniques as well. So I'd love to hand it over to our partners, Digital Shadows.
Great. Good afternoon. This is Ben Johnson with Digital Shadows. I am our field CTO. On the line with us, we also have Ben Smith. He's one of our lead engineers. So with that, I'll kick off this presentation. All right. Hopefully everybody can see that.
Yeah, looking good, Ben.
Awesome. So what are we talking about here today? Really the topic is kind of focused on, because of the recent pandemic, the big changes in our corporate environments, where now we found ourselves supporting an increased load of remote workers. And in turn, it's made our adversaries target us more often and find unique and new ways to exploit us. So I'm going to go through this and touch on these basic 4 topics. I'll touch on expanding the threat landscape, because I want to give everybody an idea of what it really means. We've been looking at threats for quite some time. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with IT or information security. We've always been fighting this battle. It's nothing new, but what has happened recently that makes things particularly interesting or particularly difficult. Next, we'll go on to threats to remote workers, mitigation strategies, and then Ben Smith, our lead engineer, is going to go through and give a demo of some of the kind of data and things you can find out there on the internet, and how they can affect you and how we can mitigate those. And I'm real bad at slides, so most of this is going to be words, and we'll kind of leave it to that. So what does it mean with the expanding threat landscape? Again, it's nothing new. It's expanding now because there's unique opportunity. This generally happens when there's some particular event, whether it's global, whether it's local. People find ways to exploit users and gain the information they want from them. The first thing is, I think, what we're facing today is increase in remote workers. I'll give some statistics out there just to kind of put things into perspective and probably give you an idea of where they'll go in the future. But prior to the arrival of COVID-19, we had roughly 3.4% of the U.S. population working from home full time. It doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you're looking at 300 million-ish people, it's quite a few people we've been supporting for some time. About 43% of those employees were already working remotely, of the U.S. employees, at least some of the time. Generally, just on weekends, getting certain reports done, finishing things up, but for the most part, we're going to the office full time. Over the last 5 years, we've seen remote work grow by about 44%. And I think that's something we can see continuing long into the future, and potentially much accelerated due to what we're dealing with today. Since COVID-19, some statistics are showing that close to 70% of the U.S. workforce is working remote, nearly 30% increase in a very short time. So this is kind of where our expanding threat landscape is mostly focused, I think. With that expansion, we're seeing new technologies. I'm sure many of you are supporting these. This is embracing collaboration solutions such as Zoom, WebEx, GoToMeeting, Skype, a number of different things there. More workers are leveraging file sharing services. Access controls are relaxing. This is likely a temporary problem, but that's due to organizations being kind of unprepared for such a drastic increase in the remote workforce. So we're seeing businesses want to keep running. They're They may not have the services planned for this, maybe not the number of VPN users, not the right infrastructure. So they're relaxing controls, take workload off IT, and get everybody online as quick as they can. Personal devices now are becoming a huge issue. In many cases, with this increase in remote workers, you don't necessarily have all the devices that were corporate-controlled devices with the proper security controls on them. People are left to dealing with devices that they either already had or they're sharing at their home. A number of different problems just related with those shared resources. Decentralization of data and services has been something that's just been very rapid in this case recently, and that's because we weren't necessarily prepared for doing business in the way we had in the past centrally, and we're embracing solutions, cloud solutions, software as a service solutions, anything we really can that allows our businesses to continue running in pandemics such as COVID-19. You go on to the next slide here. So what are the threats to remote workers? This looks like a fairly small list. I wanted to kind of keep it that way. There's obviously many other threats to remote workers, to our businesses, but I think what we want to do is focus on what's really prevalent at this time and in relation to remote workers. One of the biggest things we're seeing right now is what people call credential stuffing or account takeover. This is really kind of a brute force attack. It's becoming more common. I'll go into more detail on that further. And then phishing, obviously, that's been going on since email really started. People are always trying to take advantage of somebody, and when there's something like COVID-19 or pandemics or huge events, obviously people unfortunately take advantage of those situations. Next, it kind of plays into that, but even more so is malicious cloud applications. This goes back to us embracing so many different apps. Again, we can bring up things like Zoom, Skype, WebEx, S3 buckets, file storage, you name it out there. We're embracing these applications, and they're enabling and allowing that expansion of our threat landscape. Next, we'll go into a little bit about data leakage, and then insider threats. So first, credential stuffing or brute force attacks. Again, they're becoming more common. This is largely due to an increase in remote access services such as VPN, Citrix, remote desktop, SharePoint, etc. Where it's been so successful recently is because generally these services are brought online as quick as possible, and they don't necessarily have two-factor authentication. So it makes it really easy for the attackers to go out, basically, do username, password combinations, and just brute force it. In a lot of cases, we would have enabled something like a lockout attempt, so we would have firewalls, or we'd have multi-op authentication systems, other controls that would keep these services a little bit more secure. But what we're seeing is, the business doesn't want to put a larger load on the IT folk to, enable that support-wise. So in an effort to get business done, let's turn things on, open up to the internet. And again, it's allowing threat actors to take advantage of that. They're out there pulling old posts full of credential pairs. They're using that data. They're feeding it in. Some of them are leveraging data they've got from phishing. But it's fairly successful for them to brute force. And then once that's happened, what happens. It's going further and further into your environment and exploiting pretty much anything they can get their hands on. Again, that's just in the last month, 40% increase of unprotected VPN services. So that's your Citrix, VPN, SharePoint. Some organizations are opening remote desktop straight to the internet, and that's about all they're doing. So not the greatest way to keep things secure, definitely opening us up to additional attacks. It looks like I went all of that over there. Gives you the idea. Phishing, another old favorite one. We're dealing with this all the time. It's especially useful now, though, when we've got cases like this COVID-19 pandemic. People are worried. Attackers are taking advantage of selling face masks, medical items, whatever it is. And they've gotten, unfortunately, a lot better. Back in the old time, I guess you could say that you could easily identify you're a Nigerian scammer, prince of whoever, and send you money. And even then, they were able to take advantage of it. But we're seeing things that are much more realistic. People are out there putting applications together that resemble legitimate applications. The phishing emails are spear phishing now in many cases, so they've done their research. They know something about you. They can make something, just a little bit of effort, fairly realistic. Once they get you, it's go to a legitimate site, and you may end up with malware that in the end is used for command and control purposes. They're doing it theme targeting. Again, this goes back to how they're elevating their capabilities. They have gotten a lot better at this stuff. They're looking for things that are relevant, and they're targeting. What we saw just in this first part of the year, if you look here, this is just registration of COVID-19 related domains. So when you look back at the beginning, it's not too many of them. And then as soon as March hits, this list of domains has gone through the roof. So it gives you an idea of how many of these are fake out there, what the phishing campaigns are looking like, and where they're trying to take us. The next thing, and it does play partially with phishing, is these malicious cloud applications. And I think it even goes further than just with the phishing. Microsoft has seen almost an 800% increase in just Azure tenants alone in the last month, due to lack of security awareness training, to spear phishing, any number of social engineering attempts. These applications are hard to tell if they're legitimate or not by most users. And due to users being told to embrace new collaboration services like a Zoom, you name it, they're downloading these things. They're often rushed. They haven't had proper training, and they're executing. In some cases, this is malware pushed through Azure. People think that it's secure by default, but it's not. Data leakage is now becoming much more common. In our corporate environments, we can leverage DLP. We have corporate controls, device controls. We can control what happens with USB. It's a much more controlled environment. Now, because of us leveraging pretty much any device that somebody can get their hands on, and because we need to enable it to work, it becomes a lot more difficult to really keep track of our data. It's going out everywhere. And we don't have the visibility that we used to have when a corporate user was located behind our firewalls, sitting in their office and using our corporate computers. To make it worse, we're seeing more and more people, at least now, using shared computing resources. So maybe it's the same day one computer in the home, and Joe, the kid's playing some kind of Warcraft game at night, and in the daytime, mom's using it for her work purposes. Insider threats are another big issue, I think. And this is because it's easier to exfiltrate data. I know we don't like to think about our workers as being untrustworthy, but given the opportunity sometimes without the right visibility, and when there's grievances, potentially due to layoffs, furloughs, et cetera, it becomes something much easier for them to do. We, again, don't have visibility into that. There's so many file services. There's so many open software as service type things, and yet your data gets everywhere. So what do we do about all of that? I'm going to briefly touch on mitigation strategies. I think this will probably lead into more discussion, hopefully at the end of this talk and presentation. But we're kind of going back to the basics. I don't know that this changing landscape makes it much different than our mitigation strategies before. It changes them some. I think is what this really pushes focus on our side in supporting this and going further in the future, because I think this is going to continue expanding, especially now that we're finding ways to work differently than we did before. And my personal opinion is there are advantages to working from home. I think you can be a little bit better at your job in some cases, maybe not sometimes. It takes a little bit used to it. But what we've got to do is really reassess our infrastructure and services at the core of our IT infrastructure, and that's focusing on remote working. We need to implement stronger authentication systems that we may or may not have already had. If we did have them internally, often they have been deployed externally and through all the cloud services that we're using. We need to expand our security awareness program. That's training people. Many of us already have it, but that's taking a new look at it. Training our users on new ways to look at things, whether that's phishing or data leakage, or just being aware of what happens when you embrace all of these different services that are no longer under control of your corporate environment. And then, lastly, I think we need to take a bigger look at gaining more visibility and awareness into where our data is. Many of us have SIMs, many of us have network inspection type devices, and it's easier to take a look at where things are going or where your data is when you've got controls on your devices, when you're not sharing things, when all of your data is centralized. So with that, I'm going to let the more exciting part of this presentation get going on, and I'm going to turn it over to Ben Smith, our lead engineer at Digital Shadows.
All right, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I'm going to dive into our portal very quickly here and just show you a few kind of real-world examples. Going to leverage our search functionality to show you some actual live data. And first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you back to this graphic that Ben was showing about the domains being registered that includes the words COVID or coronavirus. This is the live kind of graph version of that data. We can actually go and see some examples here. The reason I show this is because I was curious actually how many of these are out there. You can see that we've seen some this morning. If we actually scroll down, I sort of laughed at this. Maybe I shouldn't have laughed too much, but I did notice that someone had registered a COVID-20 domain, which seemed to be a little bit ahead of the times. But this is the kind of thing that we can look out for. We can look out for things like this being registered, and it's always good to be aware of whether these things are being set up. Whether that's just, to try and fish people, there's no real knowing with this just large listed domains. But it is interesting to see that surge in registrations. Of course, the term COVID and coronavirus didn't really mean too much before sort of December time last year. So that's the obvious answer to why there's been a jump. But there are lots of different examples where people may be setting things up to try and take advantage of the fear, the uncertainty that people have around the virus. So yeah, this is the first example where that information was coming from in the slides that Ben was showing. I've got a few others as well, just to show real data behind these issues. And again, as Ben mentioned, it's not necessarily a new thing. Zoom, for me, being a sales engineer, also being remote most of the time anyway, Zoom isn't particularly new to me, or WebEx, or insert platform here. It is new for some people though. So what happens when, for example, people are sharing their Zoom links online? So if I go back to our searches here, I actually had a quick look earlier on today, just out of interest to see how many might be being mentioned here. You can see that lots of people are just posting these out there. Now, of course, this is just kind of raw data where I've searched for uso2web.zoom.us. But some of these include the passwords that we've all been encouraged to add to our Zoom meetings now to stop people from joining who potentially shouldn't be. And you never know. Definitely, I've seen news articles where people are talking about how folks are just joining random Zoom meetings. Maybe some of these are people, unfortunately, trolling other people who've posted their Zoom meetings online. It's hard to tell from this, but given that there are 24,784 hits on social media here, that's quite a lot of Zoom meetings that people could have been posting inadvertently online. And so people that don't necessarily understand the implications of having this visible may be users who don't use Zoom on their day-to-day, but actually have had to get pretty used to using it right now. This could be something to be aware of as well. Some other things that are interesting, again, another example that Ben was talking about, I think there actually was a screenshot from this particular post here in the presentation. On the coverage of some of the closed sources that we've got access to, so this is now kind of more interesting, honestly, the dark web angle of things that are going on. So posted actually back in February, new coronavirus phishing method. You can actually see here that it has, thankfully, in English translation, since I don't speak Russian, talking a little bit about how there's a coronavirus map. I believe this is the one from Johns Hopkins University that they repurposed and have somehow incorporated some sort of phishing lure with this, or maybe there's a website, some HTML here that embeds that map that will infect folks who will visit that site. You can send it via Gmail as an attachment, perfect, and we can actually also see lots of other information around there, pretty cheap, $200. If we scroll down here, we can actually see people talking, unfortunately in Russian here, about what's going on, responses to this thread, asking questions about how to implement this potentially, confirming whether or not they've had any luck using this particular tactic. So definitely something that's being discussed. You can see their daily responses, things going on a daily basis. So people are seeing these things. People are potentially talking about using this kind of tool to phish our employees, to phish customers of large organizations. I think the final example I had in the sort of dark web search area that I've got is just looking in general about mentions on the dark web and on closed sources and forums and basically the criminal underground, where we're seeing terms like COVID and coronavirus being mentioned. The first one struck my eye because I was actually giving a demo for a customer, or actually not a customer, a prospect, giving a demo and kind of looking through the results here. They're interested in learning what sort of exposure, what sort of discussions were going on around these key terms. I went and Google translated this. Obviously, most of you will see DDoS there. That's actually not too hard to spot in Russian. I also saw this 10%, which I thought was a little interesting. And actually, when you go into it, what it says here is this guy, Layer 4, is advertising their DDoS service. This actually says DDoS service, DDoS attacks on demand. Thank you to Google Translate for helping me with that one. But interestingly, this post is now on the 27th of April, so a couple of days ago. They're offering 10% off because of coronavirus for their DDoS as a service. So that's kind of interesting business model. But it does show that criminals and sort of malicious actors are adapting to a certain degree, whether that's reducing the price of their DDoS as a service, or in most cases, probably trying to take advantage of the ongoing epidemic or pandemic by developing tools and techniques that, again, exploit that fear and uncertainty that we all have around the new reality that we find ourselves in. So that's a few examples of some of the core topics that Ben was talking about, for the most part, in terms of targeting and what folks are doing in the underground. I can also show some other items around that visibility piece. I think it's important to understand where these points of exposure are and understand how you can get that visibility. So one of the things that we're actually providing a lot of blogs and things about it on our websites. If you're interested, definitely check that out. Under our intelligence library that we've got here, we've actually got a remote work risk area where we're providing some context. So what we might do is use one of those results that I've just shown you in the raw detail, and then we'll go and write something up. So actually, one of the interesting ones here, again, along the lines of what Ben was talking about, and picking on Zoom again, unfortunately, someone sharing a config file for credential stuffing attacks targeting Zoom. So exactly what we've been talking about. And this probably wouldn't have been on anyone's radar a few months ago. I think Zoom had something like 10 million users. You have to fact check me on that. I did see a graph, but I can't quite remember. A low amount compared to how many users are using it right now. So this is from, again, one of those criminal underground sources. Someone has made an open bullet config file for Zoom. And we've actually seen some examples where this type of information is being posted online. I actually couldn't find my search string to bring back that particular result that I found a few days ago, but it was basically a forum post where someone had just dumped a load of Zoom credentials or purported meeting URLs, passwords, etc. So this kind of thing is being used. These credential stuffing scripts will be being loaded with those credentials, and people will be trying to get into various different Zoom accounts. And just by the titles of these things, you can see what other things we're giving visibility into. So not just Zoom, I can pick on Microsoft Teams as well, and some vulnerabilities happening around there. So being aware of all these different vulnerabilities and different things that are affecting the platforms that most of us are probably quite familiar with, but some of our users potentially, this is quite new to them. It's a big thing that we have to get our arms around, making sure that all of these new points of exposure are now dealt with. And I think just in this sort of quick overview, the final thing that I want to show is some of the very specific items. So I can't obviously show any real corporate data or any of our data in our customers, but some of the things that we can help with here, if we go back to our triage screen. So we're giving this current visibility to our customers. So things like people committing to GitHub when they perhaps shouldn't be. We're able to tell you, so MoleNet here is our demo company. We're able to tell you if people are committing using their corporate email addresses. Is that an issue? Potentially. You can do things like whitelisting this, but it is a case of getting that visibility into understanding what, in this case, Scott Moss is committing to. Is he putting stuff out there that shouldn't be out there? Is he a frequent open source contributor? There's all kinds of reasons why he might be doing it officially, but there also might be some accidental commits. There might be sensitive information being leaked in this scenario. So that's an example of one of those. And then also things like domains. So is anyone registering domains, molenet.com, to use that same example? Are people registering domains to try and phish your employees? molenet-coronavirusresponse.com, whatever the case might be. We can give you visibility into that kind of thing as well to understand what the exposure of your organization is if people are trying to target you. Again, trying to keep in mind that fear and that uncertainty around the current happenings around coronavirus. So that was just a few examples, hopefully to illustrate some of the things that Ben was talking about and show you, not just in a PowerPoint slide here, there's actually live data. That was information coming from what we've collected from the dark web and the open web. And show you that this is all happening day to day, but getting that visibility into these things is quite important so that you can arm yourself better to understand the sorts of threats that are coming, that people are potentially falling victim to. And being able to know what's happening is really useful to be able to understand how to do things like mitigate, and at least inform your users of the risks of using things that they perhaps haven't had too much experience using in the past. So I think that's kind of the end of my portion here. I'm happy to go into any more detail if there's any questions that people have. Thanks to Red 8 for giving us the opportunity to join today. But I'll pass back to the rest of the folks on the call here and deal with any questions that anyone might have.
Again, thanks Ben and Ben. If there are any questions, please enter them in the chat, and we will review those. So we'll give everyone a couple minutes, and then we will answer some of those questions. All right, so we do have one question. Ben and Ben, not sure who wants to take this, but a lot of money was spent on remote worker infrastructure. How do you communicate, demonstrate security is needed more than ever? Now more than ever.
This is Ben Johnson. I think I might be able to answer this. So it's a difficult actual question to answer, especially if you've been in IT for a long time. You try to communicate to your business leaders as to how you justify your budgets and where you can spend your money, and it's maybe one of the hardest things you have to do. I think the key is really understanding the business language, and then putting real metrics around that business language where you can explain to your business leaders in monetary terms almost of what the loss is, what's the business impact. I think that's key. If you can justify business impact and you can put a dollar number around it, and that dollar number sometimes means not necessarily loss in, let's say if it's manufacturing, loss of manufacturing. It's really speaking to business, what is this cost to you bottom line? Whether it's time, whether it's loss of services. Once you can communicate that number, especially when you're talking to your CFOs, you'll see their eyes light up, and they'll change their tune as long as you aren't speaking necessarily that IT speak. I think that's the hardest thing for all of us IT people, is just speaking to our CFOs in the business language and showing real metrics around what it means if it's your infrastructure or your security solutions or whatever it is that it's under your control in the technology realm, is really letting them understand what it means. It's educational.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So then another question just came through. So I know that you mentioned it a little bit as you were talking, but do you see that this trend of targeting remote workers continue for a while? And then what does the future look like from a threat landscape standpoint?
I'll take the first stab at this one, and then we'll get Ben Smith's perspective on that as well, if he wants to. For me, I think it's obvious. I think all of us, it's obvious. This remote worker type scenario is going to increase. I think a lot of organizations right now, especially the ones that are maybe a little more prepared for this happening, I think they see a lot of value in changing the way they look at a remote workforce. I think you're going to start seeing increase of this, especially after the pandemic's over. I don't think we're going to go back to the norm of 90% of our workforce sits in an office, especially when they're technology workers, information type workers. There's just no reason for it. So some statistics, I wish I could remember the name of them I was reading earlier, but somebody was saying when we look at 2025, we may see 60 to 70% of regular U.S. workers working from home if their job allows it, which in turn is going to be embracing many more applications that are in the cloud, decentralization of data, opening us up more to the controls and security best practices that some of these SaaS providers have. So we're going to find ourselves, reviewing the offerings that are out there more and more, making sure they're secure, embracing those technologies, and giving us unique challenges again that we're doing now. And that's going to be the lack of visibility outside of the organization. It's going to be how do we, do something like we're all familiar with, which is BYOD. How do we take a new look at that and embrace something that in many cases, BYOD has been frowned upon. We can't really look at that same way anymore. So unfortunately, it opens us up to a broader attack surface. But at the same time, I think there's some value in it. But my opinion is we're going to see much more of it through the years.
Yeah, I would agree. Just to add on some of my 2 cents to that, I think even if the remote work doesn't continue to the same degree that we're at right now, I think there's going to be a period where people aren't going to want to go into the office. There may be reasons why. Folks like myself, I actually honestly quite enjoy working from home. I feel I get more done. There may be people that don't want to go into the office because they're concerned about separation and how do we really tell that this is all over from a virus perspective, not to kind of spread fear about that, but I feel like people are going to have that in their mind. So I think it kind of ties back to the previous question as well. We probably are going to need to be prepared for remote work to continue at a higher level that it was at before, as Ben was saying. And I was thinking, as you were answering the previous question, it may not necessarily be a way to convince people that that the spending has to happen, but in the very worst case, if you spent this money, then you've actually made security better. Even if you aren't getting attacked, you are actually shoring up the defenses anyway. So if people do go back to the office, there are still going to be more people working from home. You're still going to have implemented better security and put yourself in a better position ultimately. So I think being prepared for that eventuality is important. And yeah, I do agree. I think there will definitely be more people working from home. I think the trend will continue. And ultimately, whatever happens, you can expect that the underground, the criminals will follow that trend. They will adapt to whatever comes next, whether there's a huge resurgence of people going back to the office. I'm sure there will be something that will address that. So they will adapt to whatever ends up happening, whether that's a status quo or whether it's a shift back in the other direction.
Great. And then another question. I know that we reviewed a number of different vulnerabilities and attacks. So in this scenario that we find ourselves, how do you filter through all the noise and know what to take action on?
Another good question. It's getting context around business context around what we're looking for. I mean, you can look at it, I think, in two different areas. One that's more familiar with a lot of people, traditional SIM, what do you do with all that syslog data or data that's coming into your SIM? Many cases, there's almost no value to it. I mean, especially if you look at things like firewalls or IDS, IPS, traditional defense in depth type solutions. If you consume all this data, that's one thing. But then in the end, it's really about putting context in that data, identification of critical assets to the organization, finding ways to correlate events from multiple sources of data. In some cases, having analysts' eyes looking and evaluating this data as it comes in. But I think the key takeaway there is really just putting context around the data you're receiving and making it more relevant. And that's really how you take that, find that needle in the haystack, I guess.
Awesome, thanks. And then one more just as a follow-up to that, Maria asks, how do you tie IT and security together to help mitigate threats to remote workers? I know that we've talked a lot about this, but just a question from Maria here.
How do you tie IT and information security? Is that the question together in order to mitigate risks?
Yeah.
So that's another difficult question, actually, because it depends largely on the organization. If you're, a Morgan Stanley out there, you're going to have a fairly mature security practice. There's going to be a defined security team. Then you're going to have your IT guys. In certain cases, maybe you have an entire team of systems administrators. Then you've got your DBAs, et cetera. It's a large IT group. And there's fairly well-defined communications paths, at least how you escalate issues, alerts, whatever. It's generally well-defined. So in a large organization, it's not necessarily easier, but I think the communication path is better defined. Smaller organizations, you've got guys who wear multiple hats. You'll have network administrators that are partially information security guys. They're doing firewall administration, access controls, whatever. But multiple hats. They tend to more often keep things siloed. But then, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you've got one guy doing all of it, because there's no communication that needs to happen. So I guess the answer to that really it's defining clear communications paths and escalation procedures and how you notify the responsible parties within a business. And that doesn't necessarily just have to include, IT and information security. Again, there's lots of blurred lines between those two groups. So it's getting those communication paths to who is responsible for the unique components in the business, and then also including, I think, more than just IT and information security. I think you need to include specific parts of the business. And that's really how you get those things handled in a better fashion, I think.